Clemson has filed a lawsuit against the ACC in South Carolina. A couple things that stand out to me. Obviously, we're going to be going to billable hours for this one. So, Bud, number one, some of it seems to be very much in line with Florida State. And by some of it, I mean your exit fees and your claim to our media rights into the future. That's not fair. You know, it's like basically said like, hey, judge, please tell us that's not fair. It doesn't feel fair. Look at all these other exit fees. Look at all these other conferences and the way they handle their business. The way that they are doing this is egregious. Number two, the timing. This comes out right after the new college football playoff media rights deal has been signed, which means that it has been put publicly in very plain numbers. The ACC is going to be a little brother. I mean, it's something a lot of people knew, but it just shows the millions of dollars that are going to be in that gap between the Big Ten and the SEC. And finally, Bud, they also included this sweet, sweet little note. Hey, we never agreed to sue Florida State. Like Clemson being able to come out and say, no one ever asked us why the ACC countersue Florida State. We never said that. Lots of different ways that I think the Tigers have been very crafty with this. What's your read on the Clemson lawsuit against the ACC?
Yeah, so most of this looks very similar to what FSU is suing over. We covered this in billable hours a couple weeks ago or a couple of months ago. Whenever the FSU suit came out, a lot of these states have a law that basically says, okay, this exit fee has to bear like a real resemblance to the actual damages suffered by what you're exiting, right? Otherwise, it's punitive, it's considered a penalty, and it's not allowable under state law. That's essentially what Clemson is arguing here, much like FSU did under the law in the state of Florida. The most interesting thing that I got from this suit was Clemson's claim, which I don't think will succeed, but it is interesting to just throw this out there. And everybody pleads everything, and then you just, you kind of pick and choose what the judge will allow. But Clemson is claiming that the granting of rights only applies for so long as Clemson is in the league, meaning, yes, you signed a deal through 2036, in theory, assuming ESPN picks up the option next year to continue the deal through 2036. However, Clemson's like, yeah, if we leave, that granting of rights, that's null and void. And I don't think I've ever seen a grant of rights interpreted in that way, but also we have not had very many test cases. So it is somewhat interesting that Clemson would think to plead that, because if the court says, yeah, Clemson, you're right on that, every conference blows up immediately, right? Like that's, you can be like, hey, we're leaving and you guys don't get to keep our rights. The other interesting point, as you noted, Chip, was Clemson saying, hey, we did not agree to sue Florida State. Now, this is important because of the timing of the lawsuit. Remember, the ACC preemptively filed a lawsuit for declaration that Florida State's lawsuit was not valid and that any kind of suit would have to be heard in North Carolina court. They're in a venue fight right now. So the state of Florida is where FSU wants theirs heard. Obviously, the ACC wants to play a home game and have theirs in North Carolina, much like I'm sure Clemson will want to have its suit heard in South Carolina. Now, the ACC bylaws say that you need to have unanimous voting or some kind of vote at least to sue a school. But the ACC is interpreting this differently. Clemson's saying, hey, like we never voted on this. So Clemson is essentially declaring, we read this the same way that Florida State reads this. Like we were not, in agreement with suing FSU here. It came out that there were like 6 or 7 schools that voted in favor of having a meeting to discuss suing, but I don't know that they ever actually took a real vote on this. So this is actually sort of important because if it's determined that they actually do have to have a vote on this and it was never held, then in terms of timeliness, the ACC suit is not valid because they did not follow their own bylaws, and thus the ACC would have to refile later in time than when Florida State filed, which would, in theory, give FSU a leg up in terms of hosting venue. And I'm going to take a drink now. So there's a lot of talking in a row.
Hey, no, this is what we do. Like, I'll tell you what, man, other shows can't be able to flex this because we have an attorney right here on the Cover 3 podcast that can give you the technicalities of it all. So we're not flying blind. I mean, I would just throw things out there. So now let's get to that stage of it. Danny.
Thank you.
Like, when you're thinking about the politics of this, and I know that you've talked to some people around Florida State and just trying to like game this out. what does it feel like we are working towards in terms of the big picture here?
Florida State, Clemson getting out.
Is that it?
That's what, yeah. I mean, that's what it's always been about. I think there's no surprise. Like Florida State and Clemson have always been attached at the hip behind the scenes. I think this just makes it more official that they are kind of in this together and that they are. I mean, how many times has Bud said, you know, Florida State and Clemson are the teams that have a desire to compete for national championships. You know, Miami, you can throw them in there too, but they haven't done it in a long time. But Florida State and Clemson, currently the most relevant teams that are doing that. To have that duo together, I think there is strength in that. And I'm sure there's probably, I don't know if it's a sigh of relief, but like okay, it's about time. Like, let's go from Florida State's people that have known this, but Clemson's been able to kind of fly under the radar and not take some of the heat that Florida State has. It's just two different modes that they've gone about it. But here we are with the same place where they both want to get out and realize. And I think a lot of it does have to do. I think there was probably some that were holding out hope with the new college football playoff, with the revenue share, with the splits. Maybe it would be closer than we think when we realize it's there and it's only going to get worse because it was already double with the TV deal. Now with the playoff deal, you're looking at double again. Like that's a massive number. You know, I even saw an anonymous ACC administrator admit that. Like, you know, in one of the articles I was reading, I forget who had read it, whether it was Ross or, you know, Pete Thamel or whoever it was, said like they talked to an ACC administrator who said, combine this now with the already, the deficit they're already facing with the TV deal. This isn't surprising to the ACC either.
So I want to go back to that. Actually, this is really interesting. Why now for Clemson? Because like for me, there's three options. One, they don't feel good about the upcoming hearing for the Noles, so they want to like throw their iron in the fire to maybe have some kind of positive momentum against the ACC. Two, this new playoff deal, which sort of is the ACC putting in writing that they're inferior to the SEC, which we know they are, but it is
right.
Look, we talked about this on 2 Mondays ago. This is a tough thing for Jim Phillips, the ACC commissioner, to agree to because you're literally saying, yeah, we're inferior. And meanwhile, like that's part of the crux of FSU's suit. It's like, hey, you guys have not stewarded this league very well. Or number three, did Clemson get assurance that they have a spot if they jump? Because I've long thought that Florida State does have a spot from the Big Ten. In fact, I would like bet my house on it. But like that they really that they have a spot.
It's a big bet.
If they can get their
Does
right.
the Big Ten get your house if they don't take Florida
I was
State?
about to say, like, that's how you
hey, I'll you know, there's a lot of guys from Chicago that moved down here, Tom. So, you know,
Tony Petitti's like, I got me a new vacation house. Come to the golf cart.
We're on the
Tony Petitti gets the golf cart. That's what I was thinking.
Or like, but did Clemson get assurance? Because I don't think Clemson, as we traditionally thought about the Big Ten, would be a good Big Ten fit academically, right? But maybe that's all changing because this is no longer really about school and academics and stuff, at least in theory. Or did they kind of get a wink, wink, nod, nod from the SEC?
Andrew, what's either number one, if you got big picture thoughts, I would love to hear them. But I also know that you've got a unique angle into this from talking to personnel people, from talking to coaches, from talking to recruits, and how much of that trickles all the way down to like those sort of day-to-day stuff, because this is all so big and high level that, you know, I'm just not sure if that connection is strong or whether those storylines and those narratives get all the way down to the families and the coaches and the recruiting process. You know, what's the sense that you've gotten in terms of how things are changing?
Well, I'm going to be clear. I don't have a law degree like my fellow Orlando resident Bud over there. So I don't really have any big picture takeaways. I mean, to me, it feels like we are going towards a Power 2 conferences, right? I mean, in Florida State, Clemson, you know, they seem to fit. I mean, you said you could put the Tigers in the Big Ten. I think they're fit in the SEC. I mean, you guys have been to Death Valley, that stadium, the fan base, like to me, it feels like an SEC school. When it comes to the recruits, I mean, you ask these prospects about conference realignment, you know, the editors would always be like, ask these guys about this school moving to there. I don't think any of them really care. You know, it's gone so much from facilities and get me to the NFL to, all right, well, how much am I getting paid at X program? It's not even who the coach is there. What are you guys going to do for me off the field? In terms of the administrators, I think a lot of my contacts at the lower levels are just kind of concerned about the direction this is headed. And if they went to collective bargaining, how many recruiting support staffs are going to be trimmed down at the lower levels. So I think there is a sense of urgency maybe to get to, all right, I want to be in the Big Ten. I want to be in the SEC because I know that's where all the money's going to go and it's going to hang on. So I don't know. The recruits to me, kids want to play in the SEC. That rings true. But to me, I don't hear much about big picture, Clemson suing, FSU suing. That never really comes up.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, it barely comes up with our peers that don't work in the business. They just want to tell me when's the home game? Where's my parking spot? How is it going to fall in line with our social schedule? I mean, that's more of the common college football fan, I feel like. Sorry, Danny, didn't mean to cut you off.
I was going to say, don't you think in recruiting, the Big Ten and SEC are using this against Florida State and Clemson?
Yes.
Yeah,
well,
that's where I think it would come in. Where I think ultimately, like Andrew's saying, it's about the money. What can you do for me? But I guarantee when they're talking to SEC and Big Ten coaches, and if it's a dogfight between FSU and Alabama, they're going to say, "Hey, Florida State, they might be stuck. They might be left behind. They're suing to get out. You don't want to take that chance." So I do think it's being. I mean, everything is open season in recruiting. We know how that works. So I'm sure this is something that's used negatively against the ACC schools.
I think Mike Norvell's equipped to go head to head. And I think with Dabo, they kind of recruit a different type of individual. So yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, you look at Florida State last season, not getting into the playoff. I'm sure as some of those head coaches sat down in living rooms, that was brought up. But hey, we might be getting away from in-home coach visits if this recruiting calendar changes. Maybe it doesn't even matter.
I did think. You talk about the wink, wink, nod, nod. There was a line in the lawsuit which was saying that it was the ACC grant of rights was preventing Clemson from exploring other opportunities, which means that they are putting in a lawsuit, what we have said with our analysis, that these schools are valuable and the Big Ten and the SEC are interested in the very few chips that are left on the table that add value. But those conferences also don't want to get involved in a huge, messy legal battle. So they're telling Clemson, you go get your house in order. You clean up all this, then we'll come. So is there a wink, wink, nod, nod for Clemson? I'm not sure. But they put in that lawsuit that this with the ACC is preventing them from being able to go out and test the open market where they believe, whether wink, wink, nod, nod, or just their own confidence, that they're going to be able to have offers out there.
I will say to that point, like Bud said, he's pretty confident Florida State's got a landing spot in the Big Ten. I don't know what the current leadership of the Big Ten, how they really think and how they're going to approach this. I know that historically, based on how the conference has been run, I feel like Florida State, North Carolina, and Virginia would all be far more attractive to the Big Ten than Clemson. Now, that might be different with the new leadership coming more from the television side, where maybe they would look at Clemson and say we would rather have them just because of their football prowess. But based on what I know, I think if Clemson's going anywhere, the SEC is more likely, even though they already have South Carolina.
Yeah, well, South Carolina also might find themselves in that Texas A&M position where, Texas A&M's like, what? No, don't bring in Texas. And everybody else is like, no, we want Texas. I think that South Carolina, even if they put their hands up and say, don't bring in Clemson, I don't know if their vote is going to be holding enough weight in that room.